We're back to discuss the fallout of monotheletism and the continuation of the Byzantine Eastern Roman dominance of the Papacy and Italy. That dominance won't last forever, though. During today's episode, we will see just about the peak of the control of the Byzantines that they would have over the Papacy. New players and new trends are on the horizon. We are going to move through many of the events of this time period. There were a lot of popes in the roughly 100 or so years today's episode will cover, and we'll only gloss over a number of them. But they all deserve their due, so let's just list them here as an introduction. And this will also set the time period we're going to talk about today. We have Martin I, who was Pope from 649 to 655, Eugene I, who was Pope from 655 to 657, Vitalian, who was Pope 657 to 672, Adeodatus II, believe it or not, who was Pope from 672 to 676. So you see, we're seeing a lot of short reigns here. Donus, who was Pope from 676 to 678. Agatho from 678 to 681. Leo II, not quite the same level of Leo the Great, but hey, he's a Leo all the same. And he was Pope from 682 to 683. We have Benedict, another short papacy of 1 year from 684 to 685. Another one of John V from 685 to 686. Conan, not to be confused with Conan, from 686 to 687. So you see in this, in just a few short years, we have a lot of popes in there, especially just boom, 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 one after another, short reigns. Sergius, the first, who was Pope from 687 to 701, so one of the longer reigns, he featured two anti-popes, Theodore and Pascal, who were both had short anti-papal reigns in the 687. We'll get into that one, so don't worry about that. John VI from 701 to 705, John VII from 705 to 707, Sisinnius, who was just Pope for a little bit in 708, Pope Constantine, 708 to 715, Gregory II from 715 to 731. Again, not quite Gregory the Great, but hey, he counts. Gregory III from 731 to 741. And then last but not least, the last of our Byzantine popes is Zacharias or Zacharias, depending on how you're going to say it. I'll probably say Zacharias from 741 to 752. In this episode, like I said, it will be the peak and then the inevitable fall of the Eastern Roman Empire's dominance of the Roman papacy. This marks the very long period when Syrians, Greeks, Palestinians, and generally men of Eastern origin, either birth or Eastern familial background, fill the office of Pope. There were very few Westerners or Latins as popes in this time period. Let me give you a really short summary of the last episode on monoenergism and monotheletism, because this will be a carryover. You can go back and re-listen if you want to get details, but just to get us up to speed for today, even if you did just freshly listen to it. In the early 600s, there was a compromise was proposed to unite monophysitism and Chalcedonian Christologies, and there was something called monoenergism, or one energy, or one operating activity in Jesus Christ. Monoenergism was found to be lacking and was revised to a new position called monotheletism, where Christ has one will that comes out of his two natures, his divine and human natures. And it's actually a Roman pope, Pope Honorius, who teaches that monotheletism is okay. which was and is to this day considered heretical or a wrong teaching. And it's really this idea that Pope Honorius came up with, this idea of monotheletism, is really going to be a thorn in the side of the papacy for centuries to come. In the meanwhile, after the end of the Persian War with the Roman Empire, which was back together for a while until the Arab armies just bash through and conquer almost all of the Levant and the Holy Land. So basically there's this big war between the Persians and the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, if you will. The Persians take a ton of Eastern Roman lands. The Eastern Romans take all that land back, and then almost immediately the Arabs come out of Arabia and take all of that land that the Persians had previously taken. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Roman Church in particular, they really go up against monotheletism hard after Honorius, and they don't let up on it. For starters, today, we are going to back up just a little bit from where we left off in the last episode, when we left off with the death of Pope Theodore in 649. Let's look at the pushback against monoenergism and monotheletism in the East, because we didn't really address that in the last episodes. There was a lot of monks in the Levant and in the Eastern Mediterranean that voiced some serious problems with monotheletism. Emperors and the government, they had problems with this because they were going against the regulations to not speak about wills or energies. That was the rule of the day. And the emperor and the government really had much bigger problems. You have Islam bashing down the door. There's the last thing they really want to deal with is this internecine conflict over a pretty arcane theological debate. Now, most of these monks were Chalcedonian Christians, and they fled from the Levant and Syria and other places to flee the Arab armies. They also were fleeing from the Persians, too, previously. So there was a big exodus of educated clerics and monks and scholars who were fleeing the East, and they would progressively hop from one place to the next west. Eventually, a colony of Eastern monks wound up in Roman North Africa around Carthage. And the leader of this group was named Sophronius. And later, another monk named Maximus or Maximus arrived, and he would become a student of Sophronius. Maximus was actually a fairly high-level government leader and from a wealthy family. He left his career to become a monk, and he lived in a monastery near Constantinople. He left during the Arab sieges and conquests, as did many other Greeks and Syrians. He arrived in North Africa in late 620s, early 630s, and he fell in with this diaspora of monks fleeing to the east. Now, there's a really big council called the Lateran Council of 649, and it's a really big deal. It took place in the Lateran Cathedral in Rome. And it marked a major change in the Roman papacy to a more intellectual and Greek flavor, and it's the beginning of the change of the relationship between East and West. The East always deferred to Rome when it was convenient. In academics and in scholarship, though, Rome and the West just couldn't hold a candle to the East, though. And this disparity in intellectual and scholarly output and just basis in general of intellectual and scholarly output was closed up in the mid-600s. These Greeks and Syrian monks and academics who fled all these conquests, they kind of set up in Rome, and they really raised the level of academic rigor in the West. And really, for all of these monks and scholars, the Wild West of Rome was the natural place to go. It was still officially under the control of the Byzantine Empire, which was good, but the power of Constantinople was weak there. Popes of Rome had an independent streak to begin with and an independent power base, so it gave these monks some new tools to fight against these heresies, so to speak, that were going on in the East. Now back to the Lateran Council, Maximus and the current pope, and the first pope we'll really speak of today, Martin I, organized this important Lateran Council, like I said, which was in 649. And it was a very choreographed affair. You had Greek and Syrian bishops and monks who very carefully managed it. And it was really a full and complete takedown of monothelitism. Now, they did try, these Westerners tried to make the claim that the council was ecumenical or worldwide, really in the same rankings as up to this point. The big five Eastern councils, Nicaea 325, Constantinople 1 in 381, Ephesus 431, Chalcedon 451, and then Second Constantinople in 553. Now, the Roman emperor definitely didn't agree. According to the Roman Byzantine tradition, only an emperor could call a worldwide or ecumenical council. According to Rome, the popes ratified councils, so why not just skip the middleman altogether if the emperor was acting in a heretical way? It seemed natural. In this council and its very detailed documents kindled a fire of opposition to monothelitism all over the West and the East. As one can imagine, the emperor was not happy. He had Maximus and Martin arrested. Now, Martin was very ill even before his arrest in 655, and they treated him very badly. I mean, they just humiliated this poor guy constantly. And like I said, he was sick already, so it's kind of adding insult to injury. He was put into exile in the Crimean Peninsula. And I always ask, why are all these people exiled to the Crimea? And I can see that it was really, I mean, they were throwing these people to the end of the world, especially if you're from a Roman perspective. This is as far away from the West as you can possibly get, and really the Roman mindset. And I mean, forget about Constantinople. I mean, from my perspective, being from upstate New York, at least the weather doesn't seem so bad. I don't know. You got to take with the good with the bad. Anyways, Maximus was humiliated and mutilated too. He had his tongue cut out, which was symbolic because that's what he was using to speak out against the emperor. And he also had his right hand cut off, which symbolically, and physically too, it was used for writing against the emperor. And he was also sent into exile, and he was imprisoned in what was called Scythia, which is actually an area even further away from the Crimea. Maximus may have even gotten a more severe punishment than Martin, because, I mean, Martin was in probably something that was at least a little bit more cosmopolitan, and Martin wasn't mutilated along the way. Now, Martin, he lived a little while, at least, in Crimea. He wrote some letters back to Rome pleading for them to send him some supplies to help him out. And he also pled for his colleagues in Rome to respond to his letters. So he's firing off letters and not getting any responses. And he also made a final plea for them to not elect another pope while he was still alive. Unfortunately for Martin, that's exactly what the Romans did. The Romans elected Eugene I as pope while Martin was still alive, and this caused some minor controversy, but really not much, because everybody knew Martin was a goner. Life and administration of a big see and a big organization had to go on. Both Martin and his pal Maximus broke the don't ask, don't tell policy against talking about monothelitism, and they paid the price. Now, there's a bit of drama that goes on during the reign of Eugene. Eugene he really wanted to smooth everything over with Constantinople. He was going to accept one of the latest compromise positions from Constantinople, in that Jesus's each natures had one will. Okay, that's okay. What's not okay is each one of those wills combined into a new will, kind of like a tritheletism, and that wasn't going to last long. You could also say that it's kind of like monophysitism coming through a back door of monophysitism. So really just not a great compromise for the Chalcedonians. Eugene was more or less forced to not support this one, and the Emperor Constans II was very angry, and he promised to do Eugene like he did Martin. Fortunately for Eugene, he died before that was able to happen. The next Pope, Vitalian, made a huge mark on the papacy. He reigned for a long time, especially for Pope of this time period. He reigned for 15 years, from 657 to 672, and it marked the beginning of an almost unbroken good relationship between the popes of Rome and the emperors of Constantinople until the end of the Byzantine papacy. I might be stretching that word good, though, and good might not be the right wording. Maybe cordial's more like it, or cooperative. There's some bumps along the way, but it's really mostly normal relations from here on out. We have some continued doctrinal and political upset, though, with the patriarchs of Constantinople. And the patriarchs of Constantinople were really notoriously wobbly on theology. The popes in Rome were all, at the same time, building their reputations as bulwarks of orthodoxy. Let's zoom into Vitalian's reign for a few moments. He really had I would say, maybe one of the most interesting papacies of this time period, and really of the whole Middle Ages. As we said, the Byzantine influence during this time period kicks into high gear. During Vitalian's reign, the last time a Byzantine emperor visited Italy occurred. Emperor Constans II, who was emperor from 641 to 668, which was a decently long reign for an emperor too, visited Rome and had a very busy emperorship, if you will, for his whole time. Quickly, Constans II, he was the grandson of the Emperor Heraclius, and through a series of political and dynastic conflicts, would eventually bring Constans to the imperial purple. The Eastern Romans continued to be pushed hard by the Arabs, and Constans lost a major sea battle, the Battle of Phoenix, or also known as the Battle of the Masts, in 655. Now let's just talk a little bit about Constans' visit to Rome. It was a pretty short visit. I mean, a quick vacation, and we know the exact dates. It was from Wednesday, July 5th, 663 to July 16th, 663. Constans processed from the south through the historical center of Rome, and then eventually ending in St. Peter's, just outside of Rome, in the Vatican. Constans met up with Vitalian at the city limits, and they had a full formal adventus, the Pope and the Basileus of the Eastern Roman Empire together. And it's really a throwback to the old days of Rome, and just a ton of pomp and circumstances. I mean, really as much as you could possibly throw in. This whole thing was really meant to heal the wounds between the papacy and the emperor, and bring together the East and the West. In the meanwhile, as these meetings and pageantry were going, Constans II, he worked to steal everything that wasn't nailed down, and even a few of the things that were nailed down, like the roof tiles on churches, particularly the Pantheon, which had been turned into the Basilica of St. Mary and the Martyrs. After his 2-week stay in Rome, Constans moved on to Sicily, and he spent the next 5 years of his reign, in the last 5 years, as it were, in Sicily. There was some talk of even moving the Eastern Roman capital from Constantinople to Sicily. The aristocracy of Constantinople was not happy about this, and Constans was murdered in his bath, so the move never happened. The alternative history possibilities of this potential move of the capital are really endless, in my opinion. Do the Arabs sweep through even more quickly, taking Constantinople? Does this retrenchment of Roman power give Christendom a chance to rebuild and maybe push back earlier than they had? Who knows? I mean, I'd love to hear what you think about all of this, because this is a fascinating topic to me. Vitalian did some reforms and tweaks to the papacy as well. He started a collegium for liturgical singers. He was highly interested in the English church, and he appointed Theodore of Tarsus as the Archbishop of Canterbury. How does a Syrian from Tarsus become the top bishop in England, especially at this time period in the really what you would call the Dark Ages? It's very interesting, and it shows the huge influence of Easterners, Syrians, Greeks, Levantines on the development of Western Christianity at this time. If you want to learn more about this fascinating character, you really have to listen to an interview that I did with Professor James Early, who really lays out the whole background and context of this enigmatic figure of Theodore of Tarsus. It was a fascinating conversation about somebody who really wouldn't come to the top of your list of people knowledgeable, of people who've really carried through into the modern area of famous, but he was a household name in the Middle Ages, I can tell you that. You can also watch this episode in documentary form produced by Nick Barksdale on the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages YouTube channel, and both links to both can be found in the show notes or at a2zhistorypage.com. Now back to Vitalian. He reformed the Roman liturgical rite. We will talk about liturgy and influences of the East on liturgy at this period in a few moments. For the next 75 years after Vitalian, Greeks and Syrians would dominate the papacy. Of the 13 men who reigned as popes during this time period, only one was a Roman of Italian background and of Roman Latin background. For the record, the two anti-popes were both also Roman Italians, Latin Italians. The rest of the popes were of some identifiable Eastern extraction. They were directly from the East or of Eastern heritage. They were Syrians and Greeks. They spoke Greek and or Syrian. They were Greek and Syrian in culture. Some, like I said, were born in the Eastern diaspora, which included places like Sicily and southern Italy. They were wealthy and educated people who fled the East due to the Persians and the Arab conquests. Many of them settled into this area called Magna Graecia, which was the areas of Sicily and southern Italian peninsula, which was a natural place for them to settle because these areas were very Hellenized or very Greek in flavor. And they would remain highly influenced by the Greeks, and some of these Greek influences survive to this day. And there's a DNA evidence to speak to this, but also cultural and linguistic evidence. Just a common last name in this area of the Italian peninsula is Greco. I mean, take that as just one example of many, many examples. So that means that Greek and Eastern learning became completely normal in Rome. Greco-Syrian popes picked up on certain Roman practices and ideas, such as the primacy of the papacy, and as the popes as defenders of orthodoxy. The basic foundations of Roman liturgical rites were very much impacted by the Greek and Syrian language and practice. And I'll give you some examples. For one, the famous Hail Mary prayer. You can look that up at Hail Mary, full of grace, is of Eastern origins, which goes, the Western usage goes back to about this point in the 600s. In general, Mariology or Virgin Mary veneration traditions strongly spread from the East to the West in the 600s and 700s. Mariology was important in the West even before the 600s, but many of the modern Western theological and adoration practices go back to this time period. The procession of palms on Palm Sunday is another one. Large over-the-top papal processions around the city, particularly from the Lateran to the titular churches, was formed on a Byzantine model. There was a large-scale introduction of Greek vocabulary and terminology into Latin. For example, Kyrie eleison. It's very important usage in Roman Catholicism to this day, which means, in English, Lord have mercy. It's a Greek term, not Latin, Kyrie eleison. As far as I know in my research, the Latin term for Lord have mercy is not used even in the Latin language Mass. But I could be wrong on this one. I'll stand to be corrected. My research may not have been complete on this one. In general, the big themes of this time period are that theology became the main educational game in both the East and the West. Now it's time for people to say, oh, science was dying. If it was only for those backward Christians, we'd have like 747s by the 1400s, the Enlightenment in the 1200s, etc., etc. I mean, you can just insert statement here. I mean, we all know the drill. As things stand, though, the Eastern Roman Empire kept learning and the classics alive. This learning spread to the Islamic Empire and lands via Greeks, Syrians, and Nestorians. The Arabs spread that learning back around to the West with help from Greeks and Syrians. Greek language learning, literacy, and practice sunk into Western Latin academic and theological practice, both of them. A tale of an Anglo-Saxon bishop visiting Rome is a good example. The popes and the bishops completely spoke Greek to each other. Later in the 700s, Latin learning and literacy made a big comeback. And this was particularly when the Germans when they took over, because they really ran with Latin as a lingua franca. This is also the time when the Balkans and Greece and Thrace were removed from the Roman papacy's ecclesiastical control during the later part of the Byzantine papacy. Much of these areas would become firmly under the cultural sphere of the Eastern Roman Empire and really are to this day. And then the last theme of this time period was it's really the last time for a long, long time that the East and the West had decent relations. It would really be the long slide towards the 1054 schism and even worse relations beyond. Let's zoom into one other papacy from this period, that of Pope Sergius from 687 to 701. Obviously, he's an Easterner in origin. He was born in Sicily of a Syrian family. During his papacy was the Sixth Ecumenical Council, the Third Council of Constantinople, which happened from 680 to 681, and this finally settled the monotheletism questions, pretty much. It declared monotheletism heretical. That one sticks. We'll talk much more about this council in a future episode. Sergius had an interesting papacy from the beginning. After the death of Pope Conon in 687, there was a major succession crisis. There was two claimants to the papacy. Theodore, a Roman priest who was supported by the military in Rome, he made a run for a previous papal election but lost. And then there was Pascal. It's unknown. He could have been a Greek or Syrian or probably a Roman. He was the archdeacon of Rome under Conon, and as we've seen many times before, the archdeacon of Rome was a natural successor to the Pope. And this Pascal character was very hungry to become Pope. When Conon died, Pascal and Theodore were elected Pope by their respective factions. Pascal and Theodore both made a run for the Lateran, and each took over a section and barricaded themselves in the basilica. I mean, you kind of picture somebody putting the tape line down the middle. Hey, this is my spot. That's your spot. Don't cross over, and I'm going to put a line of pillows in between. But in the end, there was a compromise pope who was put up, and his name was Sergius. I mean, by all accounts, he was a decent guy. An Easterner, a priest. He had a good resume. He was popular amongst the various factions, the administrators, the civil administrators, the people, the military, etc. He was a priest of one of the titular churches, and so he was essentially a cardinal, a term which was starting to be used at about this time. The local military faction took over the Lateran and gave Theodore and Pascal the boot out of there, gave them the eviction notice. Theodore gave up without much of a fight and accepted that he wasn't going to be Pope. Pascal was a different story. He tried to bribe the Exarch of Ravenna to come help him out. Now remember, the Exarch of Ravenna at this time was the civil, secular leader of the Italian peninsula, ruling in the stead of the emperor. The Exarch did come, but when he got there, he saw that Sergius was the most popular with all the major stakeholders, and so he decided to back him. Pascal didn't give up so easily, though, and he had to be canonically removed from his church position. He was then arrested and imprisoned for magical practices. What were those magical practices? We don't know. What we do know is magical practices was a civil crime, and that might have been a very convenient way to just quickly and quietly get rid of Pascal. Sergius's reign was pretty interesting after all that drama, too. He had a very mixed relationship with the Emperor Justinian II. We won't get into all the ins and outs of Justinian II's rocky reign. If you want to learn more about any of these Byzantine characters, I would definitely suggest listening to the History of Byzantium podcast by Robin Pearson. I would also suggest reading the Lost to the West book, which was an excellent book by Lars Brownsworth, a podcaster and writer. In short, Justinian II had some successes, but the enemies, particularly Arabs, continued to make major gains. Carthage was conquered by the Arabs during his reign, and we did do a sidetrack episode on that, which was a very interesting time. Eventually, Justinian was taken out in a coup, but he was able to wrestle the purple back. And a fun fact, late in Justinian II's reign, Pope Constantine, 708 to 715, visited Constantinople for a full year from 710 to 711. And just generally, this whole period was a time of good feelings for emperors and popes. Not so much between ecumenical patriarchs and popes, but that's a different story. Constantine and Justinian II were able to come to some sort of détente over the canons of a council called the Quinisext Council, the 5th, 6th Council, which we'll get into in a in a bit and in a later episode as well. This was the last time that a pope would visit Constantinople until Pope Paul VI did in 1967. So a long time, almost in the neighborhood of 14 centuries. Let's not go too far, though, and reverse back to Sergius and back to this Quinisext Council. Like I said, won't go into the details yet. That's a future episode and a part of the upcoming 6th Ecumenical Council episode. What we need to know for right now, though, it was a completely Eastern affair. It was meant to finalize some of the details and loose threads of the 5th and the 6th Ecumenical Councils, therefore the Quinisext, 5th, 6th Council. It's also called the Council in Trullo because it was held in the Trullo, a building in Constantinople. This council and its canons had a few poison pill canons for the West. It put a ban on clerical celibacy. Clerical celibacy was a long-held tradition in the West, and still is, at least for the moment, and at least in theory. I mean, there's a million exceptions, but it was really the clerical celibacy was the rule since the going back into the time where there was still a Western Roman Empire. There was also a canon that put a ban on using imagery of Jesus as the Lamb in church art. And this was a very popular style and an important imagery in Western art. And there was a couple others too, but you get the drift. There was some things that that they kind of stuck in the West's craw. Sergius refused to sign off on these canons, which got Justinian II seriously angry. Justinian planned on giving Sergius the old Martin I treatment, but the troops refused to follow the orders and turned on their commander. The situation it fixed itself because Justinian was exiled for his first time, and that was that for these canons, at least for a while. In the end, Pope Constantine made a verbal agreement on the canons, which was mutually okay for both sides when he was on his big trip to Constantinople, and it just kind of buried it. One last thing to mention about Sergius's papal reign, though. There was 2 organizational events happened. Ravenna lost its autonomous and autocephalous status that it had as its bishopric. The emperor took that away and gave it to the popes as a present. A little afterwards, the See of Aquileia returned to communion with Rome and submitted to papal control. And this is officially the end of the Great Schism of the 3 chapters. Remember that one? It went all the way back to 553 when the popes signed onto the canons of the 5th Ecumenical Council. So this is a schism that was going on at that top part of the Adriatic Sea, Ravenna, Aquileia, Grotto, a couple other seas, and it was going on for a long time. Part of the package was of the schism, and one of the reasons for the schism was the condemnation of certain writers and parts of their writing corpuses. We've discussed this in detail in past episodes if you're interested. These condemnations were highly unpopular in the West, and quite a few bishoprics, like I said, went into schism over the condemnations and some other issues such as ecclesiastical independence from Rome. Well, this schism was officially finished and really helped Rome build its power and prestige in the Italian peninsula. And here we really go to the end. The end of the Byzantine papacy was really more of a fizzle. It just kind of faded out. The Byzantines lost almost all their Italian peninsula territory by the time of Pope Zacharias, who reigned from 741 to 752. Again, Zacharias was of Greek descent, and he may have possibly actually been from Greek proper. And he's the last Greek pope ever, or at least to this point in 2020. Let's be specific, April of 2020 when this episode was recorded. I mean, who knows what else 2020 has to hold for us. It's been a very interesting beginning of 2020 anyways. Over the course of the years of this time period, the Lombards and the Franks became much more powerful force in Western affairs. Overall, the situation in the East was a complete mess, and it was degrading quickly. There was assassination, civil war, and the major struggle with the Arabs, and much more. The Eastern and Western political needs were growing apart. There were some big events that happened during this time period, like the Arab conquest of Spain in 711, the Battle of Poitiers, or Tours, in 732, October 10th to be exact, an important date in my family, but many, many centuries and millennia after that. And this is when the Franks defeated a sizable Arab army in central Gaul. It's said to be the high watermark of the Arabs in Europe. The East continued to be an incubator of heretical or outside the mainstream viewpoints. The end of the Byzantine papacy saw the rise of iconoclasm, the iconoclastic controversy. This is the belief that religious art and imagery are not to be venerated. There are several factors that made this viewpoint popular in the East, particularly the fact that Islam was winning and they were very iconoclastic, or aniconic is another way to say it. I should say that icons quickly are religious pictures that are venerated but not worshipped in Christianity, and that's a fine line that many people will argue to death over, but we'll get more into that when we start talking about the iconoclastic controversy. We will focus an entire episode just on iconoclasm. So like I said, this is the short story, but for our purposes today, iconoclasm was just another issue that separated East from West. The West was strongly iconoduals, or iconophiles, lovers of icons. So I'm dropping the vocabulary in here that we'll definitely use a lot. And really, the West, they just thought iconoclasm was nuts. Like, they just didn't understand the basics of why people would have such a problem with religious imagery. Pope Zacharias made a very big decision that would change the history of the West completely, which is another story that we'll get into more. The Franks became incredibly powerful allies of the papacy, and especially in the papacy's conflicts with the Lombards. The end of the Byzantine papacy opens up all sorts of new and exciting topics to talk about in papal and Christian history. We have Irish Christianity, the spread of Christianity in Germany, iconoclasm, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, and much, much more. If you have a specific topic, maybe a topic that's nested inside of one of these topics that you'd like to hear more about, I'd love to hear your ideas, and maybe we can turn them into show topics. And just thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next time.